So what's a Stratfor? That weird word is short for strategic forecasting, basically the company's full name. May I ask, how many of you have seen the documentary The Hacker Wars? Okay, several of you. All right. That weird word is short for strategic forecasting, basically the company's full name. And in fact, according to the Texas Secretary of State registration papers, Stratfor has existed in current form since the 90s under a variety of strange names I've yet to dig into sufficiently, including InfraWorks Incorporated and Pinion Software Incorporated. The people and companies who have fed into Stratfor, folks such as Army Colonel Ron Dutchin, have been around decades longer. Stratfor's 100-odd employees mostly are billed as working for a publisher of analytical forecasts of political events. Some of this publishing is released for free online at Stratfor's website, and some of it's offered on a subscription basis by an email newsletter. Occasionally, their employees pop up as quotable experts in the corporate media. So if you want to know about Mexican drug cartels, the corporate journalist will proceed not by interviewing the cartel victims. Few reporters have the funding or mindset or language skills to do that. Instead, the corporate journalist will often talk to Stratfor, get the story from them, a bunch of ex-government, ex-intelligence guys who are from the US, not where the cartels operate, typically. That's a usual practice from the corporate media right now. Most of the time, Stratfor's personnel are quoted as experts in articles, but sometimes they actually more or less ghostwrite the pieces too. In one apparent case, the Stratfor founder said he, quote, sort of did, unquote, write an entire 2008 article for New York Times journalist Helen Cooper, a piece about the United States' lack of leverage over Russia in the Georgia clash. So if you think the news is being delivered to you by impartial journalists, think again, it's often being ghostwritten by private spy firms such as Stratfor. One very interesting thing that resurfaced thanks to the Stratfor hack is the Dutchin formula. The Army Colonel Ron Dutchin, a special ops guy who worked for a Stratfor precursor, which later joined forces with the firm, invented this formula or playbook for corporations to use in order to defeat grassroots activists. The game plan is simple. Dutchin argued that activists fall into 4 distinct categories: radicals, opportunists, idealists, and realists. Realists are the liberals down the street who aren't interested in radical change, can live with trade-offs, and see themselves as pragmatic. Industry co-opts them when they're following the Dutchin formula. Idealists want a perfect world, and if they can be taught that scary radicals hurt more than they help, idealists will convert to realists. Industry propagandizes and manipulates idealists into becoming realists. Opportunists side with the powerful for career gain and have skin in the game for visibility, power, and followers. Industry banks on them to come to the table. Radicals have underlying socio-political motives and see multinational corporations as inherently evil. They want individuals and local groups to have direct power over industry. Industry isolates and discredits them. So, to sum up, the Dutchin formula advises corporations to defeat grassroots activists by banking on the opportunists, cultivating and educating the idealists into becoming realists, co-opting the realists, and by doing all this, isolate the radicals and leave them without support. Now that you know the corporation's playbook, don't play along. Support your friendly neighborhood radical. Another interesting component of Stratfor's product has been its bespoke work for major clients who have included resource corporations such as National Oil Well Varco and Hunt Oil, military branches such as the Marines, weapons manufacturers such as Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, and plenty others. To look at some of their custom work for a moment, Dell was one client of Stratfor, and when the computer firm worried if Greenpeace's interest in one of its competitors might spell problems for them too, they paid Stratfor to put together an answer about how to keep the activists off their backs. Another example, Parker Drilling, was looking at expanding in Mexico, building more rigs there, presumably, and asked Stratfor to describe the dangers the narcos might pose in the country. A final example, for Hunt Oil, Stratfor put together a database with GPS coordinates identifying where incidents of violence had erupted in Yemen. It's understandable that a business might want to know about the dangers of operating in a country, but Stratfor proceeds from the perspective that their clients are always right. They're not going to question the corporate approach, where human rights violations are just fine. Activists are going to be problems in the Stratfor perspective, not the people bringing solutions. So what enables Stratfor to deliver this kind of intelligence to government agencies and corporations? Well, their higher-up employees are former intelligence personnel, operatives and the like, and they maintain their connections with their former employers. Even the Israeli Prime Minister was a Stratfor source. The firm's VP of Intelligence, Fred Burton, notorious for filling his emails with racist epithets such as raghead, was prior to Stratfor the deputy chief of the Diplomatic Security Service's Counterterrorism Division. The DSS is more or less like the Secret Service, but for diplomats. In that job, Burton assessed diplomatic cables for threats to embassies worldwide, and now at Stratfor he receives emails and phone calls basically asking him to do the same thing, but for the benefit of corporations, and sometimes at the expense of activists. He used to serve the public, at least in theory, when he worked for the state, but now he applies those same skills for the aid of corporations. So when you're planning your direct action or even calm protest against some corporate villain, there's a chance Stratfor or one of its competitors may be onto you and has ex-military, ex-intelligence type people keeping their thumbs on what you're preparing. That doesn't mean quit, it just means be aware that this is the landscape now for sure. So this is a good spot for us to step back a little and look at the intelligence mafia as a whole. The 2010 Washington Post project Top Secret America documents that about 850,000, so approaching 1 million individuals, have top secret security clearances. So do more than 3,600 private firms. It's a gigantic parallel society living among us. Nearly 1 in every 300 people is a member, and those in that society can give huge donations to politicians from all the billion-dollar classified contracts they get in return. Because of that magic word, private, these intelligence people aren't accountable. Like the convenience store around the corner, they don't have to show you their budgets or internal emails or bespoke products or anything else unless they get hacked or some whistleblower leaks. Yet they're increasingly running the show with a classified bribery loop to politicians and personnel crossover with state intelligence. Companies such as Stratfor market themselves as bringing CIA-type services to the corporate boardroom. Lately, judging by a South by Southwest panel they proposed and some other sources, Stratfor's been positioning themselves to get situated within universities. And I don't picture academia being much of a holdout against the spies when busy adjuncts with little personal experience outside the United States and no health insurance just want to turn to someone who can produce answers about geopolitics in a nice, soothing 3-page PDF that lays out the outline for a simple lecture. That's the kind of thing Stratfor would do. The idea that we're a sovereign state needs to be replaced with the idea that our public government is probably operating at the mercy of these intelligence contractors. Maybe not so much the lower or middle echelon ones such as Stratfor, but even more so the scarier ones such as Blackwater and DynCorp. Now, ever since 2012, when WikiLeaks began publishing the emails Jeremy liberated, Stratfor has become particularly notorious for monitoring activists on behalf of its clients, putting the well-connected firm at odds with the loose, infighting ragtag coalition of the rest of us. While sharing information with the Texas State Police, for example, they went undercover into Occupy Austin to monitor Deep Green resistance. Any collaboration between a spy firm and a state trooper should be scary to anyone. Discussing the undercover operation, one of the firm's vice presidents, Scott Stick Stewart, formerly of the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service, like Burton, made this sad comment about Occupy in one of the firm's internal emails that Jeremy Hammond hacked out. Quote, "In reality, due to the history of anarchist, animal rights, anti-war, and anti-globalization protesters, companies are well prepared for such hippie hijinks." Unquote. So that's what they think of us and our capabilities as activists. Stratfor has a bit of a reputation of being stupid and sloppy themselves, and they sometimes are, just like the FBI and the state usually sometimes is. But Stratfor is certainly well connected enough to spell trouble. The firm had, and presumably still has, easy access to information of a higher classification than that which whistleblower Chelsea Manning was comfortable giving WikiLeaks. One file Jeremy liberated from the firm records a 2009 email conversation between William F. Dione, at that time a Drug Enforcement Administration higher-up, and the company's vice president, Fred Burton. The Stratfor VP mentions a claim that the boss of the Sinaloa drug cartel then, El Chapo, might have a missile to target government buildings. Reading that, Dion at the DEA must have searched the JWIC's classified network for more on the topic because he replied to Burton that there wasn't knowledge of such a Chapo missile, quote, at the JWIC's level, unquote. JWICS is the Joint Worldwide Intelligence Communications System, a classified network containing top-secret data. When Chelsea Manning chose State Department cables to give to WikiLeaks, she intentionally selected only ones marked SIPDIS, which are for a much wider audience of hundreds of thousands of folks with security clearances. In other words, Manning had access to JWICS, but she didn't leak top secrets from it, whereas Stratfor was getting that info pretty easy from an email or phone call. And there are a bunch of private citizens running a for-profit business to help corporations go after protesters. You can see why they need to be defeated if dramatic change is to come about. This isn't a level playing field that we're dealing with. To me, it seems, though, that given Stratfor's access and sources, there should be a lot more sensitive revelations buried in the emails now sitting at wikileaks.org. My understanding is that Stratfor would often switch to using the phone or chat to discuss secretive stuff. Sometimes I wonder if the FBI somehow alerted Stratfor way ahead of time. An FBI informant supervised the hack, unbeknownst to Jeremy doing it, which we'll get to, and so maybe the FBI gave Stratfor a heads up to try to delete incriminating stuff. There are gaps in the emails, for instance. Stratfor employee 1 sends an email to Stratfor employee 2, who then quotes it in a forward to Stratfor employee 3. That should make 3 separate documents in 4 separate mailboxes, but in cases like this, sometimes one of the documents will be missing for no apparent reason in the WikiLeaks cache. So maybe Stratfor in a panic was able to delete some, but not all, of the secretive information in their mail spools before Jeremy showed up on their systems. Or maybe something else. I don't know the answer to that. That's Stratfor in a nutshell, but the reality is there are many spy firms doing this stuff as contractors for governments and corporations, and they're infiltrating and monitoring activists day in and day out. In fact, the DEA agent I was talking about, who gave Stratfor information off JWICS, William F. Dion, later went to work for Asymmetric Solutions, another one of these creepy private outfits that deployed to Ferguson at the start of Black Lives Matter. To my knowledge, no one is entirely sure what Asymmetric Solutions was doing in Ferguson, but it's just an example of these spies following one movement to the next as professional opposition. They sometimes work to get people arrested, which is one of the things you discover in detail when you start learning the stories of political prisoners and writing with them. Which brings me to Jeremy Hammond, who was caught in large part due to an FBI informant by the pseudonym Sabu. Okay, so Jeremy's quite a great guy. If you don't correspond with him, you should. His address is on the slide. It's Jeremy Hammond, number 18729-424, FCI Manchester, P.O. Box 4000, Manchester, Kentucky 40962. He started programming in lower school and in high school led a walkout against the Iraq War. He also started a student newspaper to oppose the invasion. In 2004, he created the website hacktivists to teach computer cracking skills. He was arrested a string of times for Antifa malaise and other activism. Eventually, he was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to breaking into the systems of Protest Warrior, a group that aggressively targeted anti-Iraq war activists. So he already had a prior before getting involved with Anonymous, a measure of his dedication to resistance. Writing this talk puzzled me a little about how to describe events covered in more detail elsewhere. Gabriella Coleman's book, Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, which is available down there if you want to buy a copy, is probably the best readily available source about how US-based Anonymous developed. My focus was on turning the documents Jeremy exfiltrated from Stratfor and gave to WikiLeaks into well-researched standalone news stories. For instance, I uncovered and explained that in 2010, the Special Ops Division of the Drug Enforcement Administration, technically a law enforcement agency, asked the White House for permission to assassinate El Chapo, whose whereabouts the agency knew on any given day. That's a newsworthy revelation without need for a computer hacker hero in the story. So Jeremy definitely enriched my work, and that particular article is at whowhatwhy.org if you're curious. So what I concluded for this talk was I'd like to read you a long excerpt from Jeremy's November 2013 sentencing statement. I witnessed him deliver the statement in court, and hearing it in person was very powerful. The statement also explains about the FBI entrapping him via the pseudonymous hacker Sabu. A sentencing statement like this one tears apart the consensus that we who have privilege or talents or other advantages have a right to not take or support direct action or otherwise help while so many suffer. They expose so many of us as either ignorant of the people suffering around us or as cowards complicit in the status quo. At the time of his statement, Jeremy was 28 and had already been to prison for political hacking once before. The usual impulse is to grovel and beg for lesser punishment, but that's not what we find here. His sentencing statement in its entirety is a good 2,000 plus words, so I'll say ellipsis if I'm skipping a part. You can find it in full on Sparrow Media or elsewhere. He began by thanking people and then said, quote, "The acts of civil disobedience and direct action that I'm being sentenced for today are in line with the principles of community and equality that have guided my life. I hacked into dozens of high-profile corporations and government institutions, understanding very clearly that what I was doing was against the law, and that my actions could land me back in federal prison. But I felt that I had an obligation to use my skills to expose and confront injustice, and to bring the truth to light. Could I have achieved the same goals through legal means? I have tried everything from voting petitions to peaceful protests, and have found that those in power do not want the truth to be exposed. When we speak truth to power, we are ignored at best and brutally suppressed at worst. We are confronting a power structure that does not respect its own system of checks and balances, never mind the rights of its own citizens or the international community." Ellipsis. "I have been arrested for numerous acts of civil disobedience on the streets of Chicago, but it wasn't until 2005 that I used my computer skills to break the law in political protest." Ellipsis. "While in prison, I have seen for myself the ugly reality of how the criminal justice system destroys the lives of the millions of people held captive behind bars. The experience solidified my opposition to repressive forms of power and the importance of standing up for what you believe. When I was released, I was eager to continue my involvement in struggles for social change. I didn't want to go back to prison, so I focused on above-ground community organizing. But over time, I became frustrated with the limitations of peaceful protest, seeing it as reformist and ineffective. The Obama administration continued the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, escalated the use of drones, and failed to close Guantanamo Bay. Around this time, I was following the work of groups like WikiLeaks and Anonymous. It was very inspiring to see the ideas of hacktivism, that's hacker plus activism, hacktivism, coming to fruition. I was particularly moved by the heroic actions of Chelsea Manning, who had exposed the atrocities committed by U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. She took an enormous personal risk to leak this information, believing that the public had a right to know and hoping that her disclosures would be a positive step to end their abuses. And it is heart-wrenching to hear about her cruel treatment and military lockup. I thought long and hard about choosing this path again. I had to ask myself, if Chelsea Manning fell into the abysmal nightmare of prison fighting for the truth, could I in good conscience do any less if I was able? I thought the best way to demonstrate solidarity was to continue the work of exposing and confronting corruption. I was drawn to Anonymous because I believe in autonomous, decentralized direct action. At the time, Anonymous was involved in operations in support of the Arab Spring uprisings, against censorship, and in defense of WikiLeaks. I had a lot to contribute, including technical skills, and how to better articulate ideas and goals. It was an exciting time, the birth of the digital dissent movement, where the definitions and capabilities of hacktivism were being shaped. I was especially interested in the work of the hackers of LulzSec, who were breaking into some significant targets and becoming increasingly political. Around this time, I first started talking to Sabu, who was very open about the hacks he supposedly committed, and was encouraging hackers to unite and attack major government and corporate systems under the banner of ANTISEC. But very early in my involvement, the other LulzSec hackers were arrested, leaving me to break into systems and write press releases. Later, I would learn that Sabu had been the first one arrested, and that the entire time I was talking to him, he was an FBI informant. Anonymous was also involved in the early stages of Occupy Wall Street. I was regularly participating on the streets as part of Occupy Chicago, and was very excited to see a worldwide mass movement against the injustices of capitalism and racism. In several short months, the occupations came to an end, closed by police crackdowns and mass arrest of protesters who were kicked out of their own public parks. The repression of Anonymous and the Occupy movement set the tone for ANTISEC in the following months. The majority of our hacks against police targets were in retaliation for the arrests of our comrades. I targeted law enforcement systems because of the racism and inequality with which the criminal law is enforced. I targeted the manufacturers and distributors of military and police equipment who profit from weaponry used to advance U.S. political and economic interests abroad and to repress people at home. I targeted information security firms because they work in secret to protect government and corporate interests at the expense of individual rights, undermining and discrediting activists, journalists, and other truth seekers, and spreading disinformation. I had never even heard of Stratfor until Cebu brought it to my attention. Cebu was encouraging people to invade systems and helping to strategize and facilitate attacks. He even provided me with vulnerabilities of targets passed on by other hackers, so it came as a great surprise when I learned that Cebu had been working with the FBI the entire time. On December 4, 2011, Cebu was approached by another hacker who had already broken into Stratfor's credit card database. Cebu, under the watchful eye of his government handlers, then brought the hack to ANTISEC by inviting this hacker to our private chat room, where he supplied download links to the full credit card database as well as the initial vulnerability access point to Stratfor's systems. I spent some time researching Stratfor and reviewing the information we were given, and decided that their activities and client base made them a deserving target. I did find it ironic that Stratfor's wealthy and powerful customer base had their credit cards used to donate to humanitarian organizations, but my main role in the attack was to retrieve Stratfor's private email spools, which is where all the dirty secrets are typically found. It took me more than a week to gain further access into Stratfor's internal systems, but I eventually broke into their mail server. There was so much information, we needed several servers of our own in order to transfer the emails. Cebu, who was involved with the operation at every step, offered a server, which was provided and monitored by the FBI. Over the next weeks, the emails were transferred, the credit cards were used for donations, and Stratfor systems were defaced and destroyed. Why the FBI would introduce us to the hacker who found the initial vulnerability and allow this hack to continue remains a mystery. As a result of the Stratfor hack, some of the dangers of the unregulated private intelligence industry are now known. It has been revealed through WikiLeaks and other journalists around the world that Stratfor maintained a worldwide network of informants that they used to engage in intrusive and possibly illegal surveillance activities on behalf of large multinational corporations. End quote. Okay, so there was one sentence in there that he said, I thought the best way to demonstrate solidarity was to continue the work of exposing and confronting corruption. Remember, Stratfor's still in business, and 2 years ago they raked in $12 million in investment for growth. So what can activists do about it? The exposing of their corruption has been done to a large extent, so what about the confrontation of it? That brings me to journalist Barrett Brown, in that he tried to focus the corporate media on important topics by providing analysis of the spy industry and inducing the media to move their spotlight toward it, all before NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden performed a somewhat similar function years later. So another person besides Jeremy who took on Stratfor was indie journalist and Dallas native Barrett Brown. Barrett has been released from prison but still owes hundreds of thousands of dollars to Stratfor in what the courts call restitution, but should be called ransom for to get your life back for doing the correct thing. I attended nearly every hearing of his courtroom saga, so let me share what I learned from that. But first, some brief bio on Barrett. He was interested in journalism from early on in life. He created his own newspaper on a family computer in elementary school, and as he grew older, contributed to his school newspapers. Then he interned as a teen for other newspapers. He enrolled at UT Austin and eventually dropped out to pursue freelance writing. Always a lucrative career. His first book against creationism, Flock of Dodos, was part of the atheism and skepticism movement, and it illustrated his attention to errors in the media going uncorrected and his desire to improve the knowledge ecosystem. His second book, Keep Rootin' for Putin, carried on that latter theme by tearing apart top pundits like Krauthammer. asking the obvious but rarely spoken question, why do these pundits keep their jobs when they make well-documented mistake after well-documented mistake? You might eventually realize they keep their jobs because they make well-documented mistakes, because they misinform. Well, when Anonymous caught Barrett's attention in 2010, he published an article in Huffington Post talking about the potential for internet collaboration, when so many of us can cooperate on civil disobedience without even having to know each other offline or even have any sort of central leadership. He saw the implications early and got involved. There was a spy firm called HB Gary that is similar to Stratfor, but it worked more in the cybersecurity or pseudo-cybersecurity realm than Stratfor did. When Anonymous hacked it and released 60,000 plus of their internal emails, that resulted in a Stephen Colbert skit making Anonymous look cool and the revelation that the company was trying to go after WikiLeaks. Barrett Brown was right up in there, writing articles based on the stolen documents. One particular revelation was that HB Gary was bidding to fulfill a contract from the U.S. Air Force to help it manipulate social media with pro-Air Force propaganda. This was one of the most important topics he was writing about, what he called Metal Gear, after the Nintendo game, if anybody knows them, which is persona management software. He was writing and warning about sock puppets and AstroTurf trolls coming to spam our online conversations to attack our right to communicate long before it became common knowledge. What this is, basically, is fake profiles, fake users, fake accounts on social medias that praise presidents or corporations or inject a lot of spam of some sort into the hashtags activists try to use. Journalist Aaron Gallagher has documented a lot of how that takes place now, but Barrett was calling attention to it in 2011. It was very prescient. The Pentagon, by the way, is really into this. The lead of a 2011 article in The Guardian states, quote, "The U.S. military is developing software that will let it secretly manipulate social media sites by using fake online personas to influence internet conversations and spread pro-American propaganda," end quote. Barrett was doing much of this under the rubric of his journalistic syndicate Project PM, basically a wiki website and internet relay chat channel for people to help him. When the authorities raided him, they included Project PM on the search warrant, so it was clear that his work was part of what triggered their attack. Now, Barrett had some drug problems, and those probably contributed to the rants and threats, or quasi-threats, depending on which legal theory you like, the prosecution or the defense, he made on YouTube against the FBI agent investigating him. So they came after him again, got him right when he was broadcasting by video on TinyChat. You might be familiar with that story from the Hacker Wars. He was indicted for the threats, and soon after for sharing with his journalistic collaborators on Internet Relay Chat a hyperlink to some of the Stratfor material spewing out everywhere. Because the link led to Stratfor customer credit card details, some of it already canceled, he got hit with a personal identity details trafficking charge. He wasn't even sure what was in the destination file, he told me he never opened it, that the link led to, and he thought that learning who the firm's customers were would be reasonably important in investigating the company. The total of 3 indictments against him meant he faced more than a century in prison for his minor involvement in the Stratfor hack as a non-hacker, and that was used as leverage to obtain a plea deal. One of the counts of the plea deal rendered as accessory after the fact his efforts to protect his source, Jeremy Hammond, when contacting the Stratfor founder to try to negotiate redactions to the emails, a standard journalistic thing to do. That all goes to show that it stands to reason that the authorities selectively picked on Barrett because he was having an impact. He repeatedly succeeded in getting worldwide media to focus on Anonymous and its document troves, whereas some of the smaller fish journalists swimming in the same waters, like Steve Reagan, weren't cracked down on. Of course, Barrett's threats didn't help matters, but it was just the threat. It wasn't just the threats, it was in part Barrett's journalism. Now, what does Barrett's case mean for us? The wrong message to take away would be to get scared, and indeed some journalists have explicitly said they won't link to hacked material anymore, citing Barrett's case. The case shows us that the authorities will clamp down on you whenever they decide if you're pulling sufficient attention and doing something they dislike. That's just the case for now until resistance movements gain more power. And the authorities are crazy. Sharing a link is trafficking. The Department of Justice even shared the link themselves, putting it on page 1 of his indictment. So there's no use trying to predict them. It's like, well, one day you might get struck by lightning if you piss off the gods, so don't be too stupid of a target, but otherwise just carry on. That's how I feel about it, anyhow. But what else does it mean? I mean, there are tens of thousands of HB Gary emails now sitting on wikileaks.org, and millions of Stratfor emails as well. And we could all research those and write interesting articles about the company's wrongdoing, or who's connected to whom, and what that might mean for activists and society at large. But I did that for a few years, and while I might do it again because it does have some positive impact, I kind of came to the conclusion that, a lot of these articles, they aren't resulting in reforms. I do want to mention Austin Community College philosophy professor Azura Crispino protesting at Stratfor every year on Jeremy's birthday. That's great. It's really good that someone keeps attention on Stratfor. This picture is from Bring Your Cat to Stratfor Day, since Anonymous likes cats and not Stratfor. It's her dressed as a cat in a litter box dumping on the spy firm. So that's all really great. But what about, say, William F. Dionne's ability to research JWICs for Stratfor? Is that stuff ever going to stop? With Barrett, he had to write these wall of text articles at Project PM. Are you familiar with the term wall of text? It's where you have, you look at a screen, it's just words and words and words and words and words, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to read all this. It's just this wall of text that kind of imposes on your time and is not necessarily the best way to generate meaning out of a bunch of content. So that happened with the Panama Papers leak recently. Those resulted in some action, but not nearly as much that could have happened because the database built for the analysis of the Panama Papers was kept private for the journalist involved. And the rest of us just got these wall of text articles about this person transferred this much money and the time to fall asleep because how does it connect with our lives? So now, former WikiLeaks central editor Heather Marsh has a formula she used to organize information at that website back in 2010 to 2012. News, analysis, action. We all have the first element, the news, batted at us all the time. That's our overflowing Twitter streams. Imagine a cat watching a tennis match, turning its head left and right to follow the ball. Well, imagine hundreds of those tennis balls being batted back and forth in all directions, and the cat just looking every which way. That's what the news is like. And the cat sees that the news is bad, and maybe it can retweet this, and maybe go on a vigil about that. But really, a thorough campaign targeting the roots of the problem is really rare. That takes a lot of analysis to determine where the vulnerability is, where can activists strike to make a big difference. When it's just news, and there's no analysis, and there's no informed action, it's just voyeurism or titillation. Anonymous does have some operations that fit the bill, such as Op Canary, targeting resource corporations, and Op Death Eaters, targeting pedosadism trafficking networks. But these still have to fight for attention in the sea of all those tennis balls tweets flying around, and they also need some more analysis. So news, analysis, action, you want those three tied together. I saw an article in The Guardian the other day. It was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is all kinds of corrupt, and the lengthy article had a take action embed in the news article where you could click to send money to supposedly fix the problem detailed in the piece. So that was a bit of news combined with some analysis and concluding with a call to action, only it was sponsored by one of the richest billionaires in the world. So the opponents have definitely figured out the news, analysis, action triple threat combo. We can't just have news, the tennis balls and millions of tweets flying around begging us to pay attention to this or that. And what they really do, it seems, is to empower Twitter micro-celebrities rather than foster much of a nuanced conversation. We have to have the analysis so the actions we take about the problem are informed. Part of creating strategy is being able to analyze the opponent. I mentioned the DEA higher-ups and Stratfor source William F. Dionne left the DEA and went to asymmetric solutions. I just mentioned that guy's name in every talk I have because it just gobsmacks me that some private individual sitting at the DEA, he was a public, some private individual at Stratfor could phone somebody and say, give me information off of JWICS, the top secret communications network. Anyway, I mentioned that DEA higher up in Stratfor source William F. Dion left the DEA and went to asymmetric solutions in Ferguson. That sort of analytical connection enables us to chart out better what the corporate spy industry is, to build a model of it which we can then study to find weaknesses. Those weaknesses might tell us, whom can we boycott to solve this problem? Whom can we offer a way to exit the intelligence industry and become a more pro-social member of society? Someone who might write a whistleblowing tell-all or become a masseuse or something a lot nicer than a corporate spy. Or what spies do we just need to follow around the street like those protesters of Petraeus chanting shame until they just quit their jobs so they can eat lunch at a restaurant in peace? Right now, many of our attempts at analysis and action are really reactive and driven by current events in the news media ecosystem and its economic incentives to publishers. If you're a journalist, say, and El Chapo gets arrested, your editor tells you to write a 500-word piece explaining the significance for his magazine's audience, and it's almost always a he, running the news. Well, why do we have to wait until El Chapo is arrested to do this, or why do we assume that the magazine's particular audience are the people best positioned to do anything about drug cartels? Why 500 words in narrative form, which basically feels good to read because it's story time, instead of, say, building an app on your phone that tells you what to boycott to hurt cartels, or which refugees to shelter from cartels in your area, or what workers to support in an economic strike? Without analysis and action, the news is just voyeurism. When I was trying to think of how to do this presentation, a friend suggested I make a list of the top 5 or top 10 or so revelations from the Stratfor documents that Jeremy hacked out. I want to give you 2 revelations in a moment here, both ones I uncovered by digging through the emails and wrote up as articles for Who, What, Why. Notice how these 2 revelations are disconnected from the kind of social meaning that would incite action. First, between 2010 and 2012, and probably for longer than that, Mexican military helicopters routinely crossed into U.S. airspace, not just the one fluke time that made it into the U.S. news when it happened in Arizona. Second, General Petraeus brought a mistress, possibly Paula Broadwell, his biographer, to a private dinner party with the Yemeni ambassador to D.C. in 2010, a year before the extramarital affair that took him down from the CIA supposedly began. So those are 2 news revelations or factoids. They're supposed to startle or shock or surprise you. On Twitter, you can see how much journalists compete with one another, arguing over whether a revelation is or is not surprising, as if that particular emotion in the limbic system is what's crucial. And it is for getting people to click and for the media website to get ad revenue or impress nonprofit donors about the website's increasing traffic. But the drug war still continues, turning humans into refugees. Petraeus is making a world comeback on the world stage last time I checked. These jolts of surprise issued by the news media and batting around everywhere like tennis balls, confusing us, need meaning or significance explained. The analysis to connect the revelation with the everyday life level for the majority of us to feel inspired to take action we believe in. We need apps that tell us where are the drug war refugees in our areas, which banks are invested in the production of the military helicopters, which of my friends in Food Not Bombs are evaluating credit unions to see which one is the least bad to switch to, things like that. We need the story narratives too, of course, but without the stories tying into analysis and action that hits us on a personal everyday life level, the stories won't generate as much change. Now, of course, you can read Green is the New Red, a great book, or some other journalism book and get inspired and join your local activist or something. I have a friend who did that. But we need to multiply the effect of such a book by syncing it up with such apps that aren't dependent on corporate infrastructure such as Facebook. We don't want our activism to exist at the mercy of Facebook or Twitter. Barrett's planning a software project called Pursuant to fix problems in the media ecosystem, which you can read about in Wired and elsewhere. I wish him well with it, but the thing I worry about with both the H.B. Gary analysis from 2011 and pursuant is that both still seem centered on this wall of text concept out of yesterday's journalism. Here are 5,000 words, read them, Stratfor is bad. Okay, but what does it have to do with me? Those revelation factoids I mentioned out of the Stratfor link a few minutes ago, does anybody in the audience even remember them now? Something about helicopters, something about Petraeus, and that's what it's like reading the news, because it doesn't, unless it hits you on some personal level. So that's the difference between Mexican military helicopters, something, and a military helicopter shot my friend's mom yesterday, and I had to deal with the blood, so now I'm angry. Once we're building apps for news and analyses, we can make the content hit people much more viscerally because they can see how it impacts their daily lives. I'd like to conclude by telling you about this great project former WikiLeaks central editor and author of Binding Chaos, a book that's available down there, Heather Marsh is building called GetGee, Getgee, all one word as it appears on the slide. I think it could help us solve those problems where we need audiences, journalists need audiences to be hit more viscerally by the stories to take action. Heather Marsh is the writer and programmer, and GetGee is a universal database and trust network. And I think if we can support it or help find support for it, whether that's programmers or funding, the project has a very strong potential of really upgrading what activists can do in the future when people such as Jeremy Hammond unearth misdeeds or connections between corporate wrongdoing and malevolent actors. As a universal database, GetGee handles 5 fundamental entity types: people, events, things, organizations, and ideas. Just as the ocean and ozone layer are in the global commons, so these database information nodes would be owned in common globally. These 5 entity types form the foundation of the meaning we make at higher levels of the database through levels of analysis she calls constellations and galaxies. The important thing to understand is that GetGee decouples these 5 data entities from corporate software. So for example, this talk is an event that was promoted on Facebook and Twitter. We were at the mercy of 2 Silicon Valley corporations as to whether we could share tonight's event. There was an event page on Facebook, there were tweets on Twitter, but if the tech billionaires didn't like it or anything else, they could shut it down. I think any activist can relate to the fear that the social media corporations are going to silence you. OnlineCensorship.org is a really good resource with plenty of examples of activists and other posts getting wrongly censored. When people, events, things, organizations, and ideas are information nodes that anyone can create and work on, then they all belong to us, and our progress working on them is not at the mercy of tech billionaires or anyone else. So GetGee allows that, and it also allows the option of using trust networks to filter information. That helps deal with the Metal Gear astroturfing spam machinations Barrett Brown found as documented in the H.B. Gary files. So next time someone such as Jeremy Hammond comes along with a big leak, with GetGee, that data can be easily uploaded into source media nodes and relationships mapped to be used as a resource for all researchers and journalists. Any outside person could create and link different constellations containing other information, making research much faster and more productive. We would have the data in a permanently usable format in a global commons for us to build from, instead of unusable wall of text articles everywhere in a private database for select journalists. Instead of tweets flying everywhere like tennis balls distracting everyone with new article installments that contain trivial updates or no updates at all, we would be working together to create in-depth knowledge. People could even build apps based on the hack leak data because the information nodes are decoupled from the software. You could create whatever software you want to interact with the nodes. There was a case a few years ago where an indie developer made an iPhone app that would notify users every time the US killed people with a drone. Apple shut it down. I think they said it was too disturbing or something like that. With GetGee, we wouldn't be dependent on Apple and we wouldn't have to go through them to create an app. It's just, say one human rights organization is contributing the research to the GetGee event nodes for drone strikes, then someone else comes along and says, hey, that's interesting. I'm going to make a free software app that every time a drone strike happens, post a message about how to BDS the US. Sure, one app might get taken down if it's trying to publicize the info on some proprietary platform, but because the nodes are in a global commons, the whole work isn't lost. The structure is an ecosystem where another app could take its place. So you can see how replaceable front-end software apps interacting with global data commons could really invigorate the news such that reading it affects you viscerally when apps are made that show you how to take action based on that information. My understanding is that GitG needs funding and programmers skilled in IPFS or React. So if you have those things, go to that website up there and get in touch with that team. I think I'll stop here and take questions, if there are any. Questions about anything? Yes?
So, in thinking about how this extends into the present day, you have Eric Prince basically on the verge of a private war in Afghanistan, right? Which is very much connected to the Stratfor concept, I think, in terms of the ability of a private corporation to take information that would be top secret and use that in a way that's profitable, right? And purely about profit. And then at the same time, you have net neutrality under fire. And so it seems like there is a very clear war on information and who has access to it. Is that a fair extension of everything that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. The really hard coercion that governments and apply to us, like prisons and military, we wouldn't tolerate that if it wasn't for the propaganda and the way we're just kind of lulled into accepting it as normal. So that's why the powers that be so desperately want to control information flow to keep people passive. So with the attacks on net neutrality, for example, I mean, that's what they're trying to do. And so if you put the information nodes in a commons where it's like the ocean or the ozone layer, then it belongs to the public.
So just a quick follow-up. Is that privatization of war the biggest threat that comes out of this, or is there something else in your mind?
I don't know how to rank the threats. You know, I mean, global warming, privatization of war, but you know, they say now that we've left some war theater, and that's usually code for we left private contractors there. You know, I think Eric Prince is working for China now. And then parts of Blackwater are still working for the U.S. And so it's like really mind-boggling, you know, who's allied with whom, and it's kind of a mafia.
I mean that sincerely.
Yeah,
I thought there was discussion about him working with Russia.
Yeah, so don't be shy. Yeah.
You're pretty big on the idea that the establishment doesn't respect its own system of checks and balances, nor the rights of U.S. citizens, or its own citizens rather, and it's really stringent on maintaining the flow and availability of information, like kind of we've been exposed to today. I'm curious. Since they are sort of this all-powerful entity, you know, like how like you've managed to stay alive, and how much danger someone like you is in, and second part of that is why not just, you know, silence any sort of outbreak of information if they are these.
With someone in my position, it's a lot easier to marginalize someone through economics, and it's a lot less messy. It's hard to get journalism gigs that pay well, that can continue doing this kind of work, and that I can use the words that I want to use instead of the neutral, watered down words that the corporate media or even nonprofit media wants to use. So there's no need to bump me off in a motel. Yeah. It's just a lot easier to be like, okay, well, he can't find a publisher. Yeah. Okay. So I mean that's the same thing. I mean, it's kind of a self-selecting system that just marginalizes people and beats them down because they can't find a way to. I mean, Barrett's really admirable in that he's been able to continue promote getting attention on these topics, and I think that he did eventually get imprisoned in part for his journalism and for bringing these topics to light. So I also think one theory I had was when I had an investigative partnership with WikiLeaks through which they published files for the first time in conjunction with some of my articles. It was at a fairly small fry outlet, a great outlet, but a small place, growing place called Who, What, Why, and they are really into talking about the Kennedy assassination and how the Warren Commission theory is just kind of bogus. And I thought, this is they probably think that if any authorities are reading my articles, which I don't think they are, but if they were, they would probably think, oh, well, it's good. He's kind of discrediting these files by placing them on a site that questions Oswald's lone nut theory. So.
Now that it seems like YouTube, it seems like a lot of them are being taken down. They're being much more censored. Are people uploading to anything else? Is there any other place to go to find it?
It's constantly a whack-a-mole kind of war. Where activists are trying to find a place that can harbor their videos. I don't know. Unicorn Riot is a really good indie outlet that covered the Standing Rock. Yeah, and I would, if I were in the business of uploading activist videos, I would, look at somebody who's succeeding and see what they're doing, copy that, use it as a model.
Just out of curiosity, just your opinion, you've got the executive branch using the Department of Justice to go after and try and get the IP addresses of everybody that to protest against Trump. They could get all that going this route, without anybody knowing about it.
What is this route?
Well, I mean, they go to the private contractors, and Trump's got enough money to do that on his own.
Yeah.
So, do you think that they're doing that? Is that just the chilling effect that they're hoping that it'll have, letting us all know that, that if we went to that demonstration or thought about going to that demonstration, they've got a direct link into our computer? Or is there some other reasons that you could think of?
Yeah, I think it's partly chilling effect and partly to map people out. I'd also worry about retail surveillance data. One of my day jobs was ghostwriting for a company that sold surveillance software for consumers, targeting consumers at grocery stores or retail shops, basically. And they want to collect as much information as possible to build a profile of you as a patron, as a shopper, and so they can sell stuff to you. So it's not just spy firms, but it's also Madison Avenue, the marketers, and and so they're those archives of information probably will be sold as well. There's also medical data is a really hot commodity in the black market of hackers and stuff. Medical data. Well, they use it for identity theft a lot, and it's a lot more unique than credit card data. It's like credit card data can be canceled, and you can fix it, but your medical data is always going to be, your blood type's always going to be your blood type. So there was a story in the Financial Times about Google's artificial intelligence had accidentally gained access to a bunch of British, I think it was NIH data, medical data, just millions of records. And so you think, what is Google going to do with all of our, it's scary. Yeah.
Now, is there such a thing as an accurate, I'm not sure what words, descriptors to use, an accurate or reliable anonymous website?
Browser, you mean? Like a web browser?
Yeah.
Or a website?
Either one.
A lot of people are gung-ho about Tor, the onion router, which the onion router, Tor, which initially was funded, I believe, by the State Department and the Navy, so that has also caused people to distrust it. And I think it goes back to what I was saying about Barrett's case. If you get in this business, you just sort of stop worrying about the lightning striking at a certain point. And there are different networks. There's Tor, and there's the Tor network, and then there's the Clear regular network, and it's just like these are different ways to communicate. And I'm not sure how much trust I would place in Tor myself, but probably not much.
So what do you as a journalist do as far as anti-privacy?
I think one thing that everybody can do that's pretty helpful is to just use an ad blocker. That's a pretty common thing. There's AdBlock Plus. As far as communicating with potential sources, I have email with PGP. So somebody could send me an encrypted email. But as a freelancer, I don't have the infrastructure of a outlet with a legal department and all that kind of thing. One of the things that I talked to one of Barrett's attorneys about was how could Barrett have better protected himself? And she said when he went to Stratfor and attempting to negotiate redactions, and she said if he had been on assignment with like Wired or something, that would have lended this whole veneer of credibility that would make it much harder for the authorities to persecute him. So when you're an indie freelancer, you're just kind of like, you don't have that infrastructure.
I think you mentioned some kind of software that was trolling activists, scientists, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so in about 2010, 2011, when the HB Gary hack happened with Anonymous, one of the big things that Barrett Brown uncovered was persona management software, which he started calling Metal Gear, and that was a name that didn't ever really take off. But persona management software is where basically whoever is running it creates many fake profiles. So you probably had on Twitter or on a dating app have somebody, this amazingly beautiful Russian woman contacts you with a strange name, and you're like, this isn't even a real person, And a lot of that I think is probably marketing research of some sort, but they're kind of the fake avatars that persona management software specializes in creating. So the Air Force was bidding a contract to do this. The idea is that you have a bunch of fake personas promoting propaganda, and it looks like real people, or it's supposed to look like real people. It's still clumsy right now, to where the point where journalists such as Aaron Gallagher can kind of pinpoint, okay, these are the fake ones, and here's what they're doing. But there's been real problems where in Mexico, activists will try to adopt some sort of hashtag to start communicating and talking about an issue, and these fake personas will inject spam into those hashtags. They'll just start tweeting using the hashtag and saying the opposite of whatever the activists are saying, and just muddying the waters to make the communication unusable.
Is it automated, or is it?
Some of it is and some of it isn't. A lot of it is really automated to where that's one of the ways you can detect it, is because all of a sudden 20 people will tweet the exact same thing at the exact same time during the President's State of the Union address or something. It's like, okay, well that can't be a coincidence. Those have got to be fake profiles.
You're talking about a lot of the corporate media getting their information through like Stratfor and Wisconsin. I was listening to NPR today, and you know, with the Charlottesville thing, the technique they seem to have is there's something that's controversial, and they'll pretend like they're taking the liberal side, but most of the people they're interviewing, you know, Fair and Balanced News are like white supremacists and you know, KKK members and stuff, and how it's like, what are you people up to? What do you want to do? And you know, and so they give a mouthpiece for these white supremacists to say what they're all about and what they want to accomplish. I don't know if there's any way, you know, you've thought of to contradict or to make people aware of just how, you know, corporate and right-wing, even stations like NPR are becoming.
Yeah, I think media criticism is really helpful for enlightening people. Like
what venue?
Chomsky, for example, like his writing. There's also a blogger by the name Tarzi, Tarzie, who blogs at a site called the Rancid Honey Trap, and he basically takes Chomsky's approach and applies it to figures such as Chomsky himself and Democracy Now! So he starts going after Democracy Now! And Chomsky, and you know, and so it's really amazing to read because they're all subject to the same sort of constraints of the propaganda model as NPR or the New York Times. Mm-hmm. So there's also, I think, a real element to it where people in media start treating it like a job, you know, and they're exhausted and they're a job, and so the producer is lined up, okay, here's what you need, and it's the same thing, you know, a reason that the police is so frequently a source in the news is because they have the resources to put together press releases and get them in the hands of the journalist, and it's all right there, and you just copy it out and you're done. You can go home, you know. Anybody else? Leslie?
I'm curious if you have any idea, we're thinking a lot about the evolution of surveillance and repression in recent decades, and I'm curious if you have any idea like how much of this private surveillance is really taking place. Like if somebody, people fighting against Monsanto is a good example, right? Since they have some ownership in Blackwater or whatever they call it now. Like how much do you think somebody could reasonably expect that they're going to be surveilled by private entities versus the typical, like, you know, FBI file scenario that will appear for people? Do you have any idea?
It's hard because they're private, so it's rare that we get a look into them, which is why Jeremy's hack was so important. But I think it's pretty reasonable that once you start doing damage to a company, they're going to hire the fixers to come take care of you, you know, or yeah.
You had a follow-up to that. I can't remember what it is. But I do know that, for example, the Shack case, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty campaign, there were people in the early 2000s that were arrested by people who seemed like they were in some kind of governmental agency, pulling up in black SUVs with tinted windows and fully armored and, you know, and armed. And they would just round the activists up and throw them in the back of these SUVs and speed off with no, you know, notion of it being a legal arrest, and not taking them to a jail, taking them to some other place and trying to interrogate them and not even go without charges. And we hear very little about this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think with the nearly 1 million people with the top secret clearance, it starts becoming this parallel society, and they start having their own norms and their own, like, okay, it's okay to do that to someone. It's okay to throw them in the back of a van, and, you know.
And I remember my follow-up is, what are the advantages of a private? Can you be explicit about what are the advantages of private security or infrastructure like this over the standard, you know, FBI style? What is there to gain?
It's opaque. they're you know, it's even more opaque than, you know, with this bookstore you were able to get documents about the FBI monitoring it, but with a private spy firm it's very, very hard to do. So there's no accountability unless it's forced transparency.
How does corporate personhood do that?
Corporate personhood?
Yeah.
I think it's because Heather Marsh has this term supranational empire, meaning an empire that's above the states, like the United States, France, Germany, different states. And it's the idea that the corporations are even more powerful than the states now. And so if they can, it's like having a somebody who speaks your same language, you know, if the private spies are also of the corporate world, then they understand how it should be done, you know, and they're more allies with you than the FBI might have more paperwork and more checks and balances.
So the little thin veneer of
Yeah.
transparency that we complain about so much with agencies like the FBI is completely gone with
Right.
Stratfor.
Right. And you can hire Stratfor or Blackwater to do whatever for you, and if you pay them enough, you know. I mean, people still go into the state services thinking that they're serving the public. I mean, that's kind of their mindset. Some of them, I think, but when you go to the private spy firms, it's just, all right, how are we going to make a bunch of money? What's the job here?
And my last detail is how much of a sort of revolving door or a retirement plan is this kind of thing for these agencies?
Huge. I did a basically an article on John Brennan, the former CIA director, that was published at Who What Why. It's basically a little biography of him, and it showed how he went from public, quote unquote, public service to the private spy industry for a while, and then I think back into the CIA for a while. And there are, you know, he was paid some ungodly amount to just sit on these boards, basically, and there are all these private spy firms, lots of them. I think there's a book by Timothy Chirac called, I'm blanking on the name, I can't think of the name, but he documented a lot of it. And same thing with John Brennan, the CIA director, you know, being an example.
So my very last point is it the case that, like say there was something that the FBI, just as an example, couldn't legally do, or wouldn't want to be known for doing?
Yeah, cutouts.
They could contact a former FBI employee who's now working for one of these companies and subcontract out that work so that it's done anyway with their hands are clean of it. And then the people who are running that company wouldn't be held accountable because of essentially corporate personhood, like essentially like the corporation be held accountable and no individual.
Right. I'm not sure, but it sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah, just trying to totally grasp
Yeah.
the future from that.
And the security firms, do they work together, or do you think there's like a competitiveness?
You mean the security in the public?
The private security firms, do you think that they're sharing?
I think they're competitive. You know, one of the strange things that happened when I was doing my journalism on the Stratfor emails, I would call up some of their sources, and I'd be like, "Hey, did you talk to Fred Burton lately, who was the VP of Intelligence at Stratfor?" Because I was trying to get a confirmation outside the WikiLeaks data that these people had actually emailed with one another, and they would get really kind of scared when I mentioned Fred Burton's name. You know, and I think that was mostly because they were worried that they might lose business or they might lose jobs. So I mean, it's kind of like, you know, you have an industry where different firms are nominally competitive, but they also like employees go from one to the other, so you don't badmouth. You know, like if you're a wait staff, you know.
Where do you see this whole thing going? Is it going to come to its demise someday, or is it just going to keep blossoming and blossoming?
I think it's going to get worse unless we get that GitG global data common so we can figure them all out. I mean, I think, you know, it's scary. So, it's it seems tracked a lot to me. It seems to track a lot with employment and whether the population is content or not with going to work, and the more oppression the powers need to deploy on the public, the more social control they need, the more they think they need, or the more data. A lot of it is profiling people, building profiles of them based on their internet browsing habits and that kind of thing, and then they just can smack down on anybody.
Do you have any thoughts about how this changing technology might impact on our elections?
Yeah, there's a really good book called Code Red, which talks about the problems with digital voting. So I don't know how it is here in Buffalo, but most of the places in the U.S. use either optical scanners or touch screens, and the voting equipment is proprietary, it's closed source, and it's corporate, and it's all this kind of stuff. So there's no real reason to trust the vote tallies, and there's a lot of, in that book, Code Red, the author, Jonathan D. Simon, documents the redshift effect where, what's it called? The exit poll samples don't line up with the final vote counts. The exit polls are more blue than the final vote counts, leading him to suspect that the vote totals are being manipulated. But basically, unless it's done on a paper ballot counted in public, there's no reason to trust the proprietary, closed source, corporate voting equipment. And I think, too, representational democracy, which I don't support, is a way of dividing people up into populations competing for advocacy. And it's a way of, and so, the more that these different subsets can be profiled, the more they can be played against one another, because the more each one is understood better. If that makes sense. Like the surveillance allows, or they think it allows. I mean, sometimes you got to question how well it really works, but the more they profile people, the more they can understand them. So if they're dividing up people to compete for advocacy and representative democracy blocks, then they can have people fight one another more. The divide and conquer kind of counterinsurgency.
Okay, I'm just curious what you think. As far as when Jeremy is pulling all that stuff down and Brown's writing about it, I think a number you use is 1 million people in the U.S. with top security. And then out of that million, how many are in public and how many are in private? And don't they usually give that up when they go to private? Although we know that sometimes not, because a lot of private security companies are doing things to do it. They're being commissioned to do.
The Top Secret America project at the Washington Post would have the most accurate figures, because they did the grunt work of counting, tracking all that stuff and getting the numbers. So I think it was something like 3,600 private firms. But I don't think they have a number on how many are in public service and how many are private.
And then
they might.
And then when that information was released, was there any outcry? No, there's not. I don't know why I'm asking a question. But was there any outcry whatsoever when you had a private company calling people in the public sector that had the security clearance that they needed access to get the information? They're violating right there. It's treasonous theoretically. They're divulging top secret.
That's why I'm always talking about William F. Dion and the JWICs thing, because it's really surprising to me that that happens so regularly.
And then that was all released in Jeremy's stuff, and nobody gives a shit.
Well, people did for a time. Yeah, there's also the bit of the kind of the hero worship thing happening, which I tried to focus a lot during the time. A lot of the articles were about hacker heroes. and all this intrigue of these cool hackers and who's in lulsec and who's in ANTISEC and all this kind of stuff. And so I tried to turn the documents into valuable articles that could stand alone from that kind of. So I mean that news is important too. That's part of the story, I guess. But I tried to separate it out to make it more of a. But I think you should check out that Top Secret America project with the Washington Post.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's so hard to trust anything these days. You mentioned Say Democracy Now!, for example. Now, and they're not perfect, and I'm all for questioning everything. Questioning, and it's okay to criticize, constructive criticism for anything, myself or a group I'm in. But how do you know, okay, if you're getting information, say for example, Democracy Now! Or an individual, that's not just trolls,
Well, I think
you just maybe have to keep doing more research and
I think
the best evidence you could.
One of the big things that has happened in the last 10 years has been people have started to realize that NewYorkTimes.com is not necessarily more trustworthy than randomjoeschmo.com, who has studied whatever topic as an amateur for half his life and is writing all this great stuff about it. People are starting to realize, like, hey, and I think the way we navigate trust networks, where it's like, there's a concept when it's the for PGP keys, for encryption keys, where you have a trust network and you look at like, two of my most intelligent friends trust this key, so I'm going to trust it 2 or 2.5, or I want 3 people. So you can apply that same sort of reasoning to news and to information in general, and analysis, where it's like, how many of my friends, with this GetG database, you could say, it's also a trust network, you could say, how many of my friends trust this episode, or this interpretation of the data, or this analysis of the data. And you could say to the database, only show me information that has a minimum of 3 people trusting it, or something like that. And I think like there's been a lot of centralization of knowledge with academia and medicine in particular, where they can start having this is the true narrative, and people start questioning it, and it's really kind of bad because you can't always trust the counter narrative either. So when people in person, like they always say in marketing that the best recommendation is a personal one. Like when your friend says, "Hey, let's go to this restaurant. It's really great." So that's the kind of filter that we need to be able to apply to all sorts of knowledge. Is how many of our people in our trust network believe this particular bit of information.
So with these trust networks and like decentralization of journalism and knowledge in general, what becomes of the collective consciousness, and like do we become further isolated from each other or atomized, and or what is the benefit of that?
I think it's something we already do, and so being able to formalize it would help us see how it functions and how to use it better, how to use it worse. Does that make sense?
A lot of it too over the last however many years, all these individual New York Times start getting bought out by other people, bought out that what used to might have been the New York Times doing its own thing. We're trying to get that again. It's just alternatives, which we think we have, but we don't, because they're all owned by very few people. So it's sort of like this.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also the thing now of billionaires going into having their little journalistic fiefdoms. So Pierre Omidyar, the head of eBay and PayPal, owns The Intercept, which is what a lot of people go-to for what they hope is fearless adversarial journalism. And then the Washington Post is now owned by Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. Yeah, so and I think Carlos Slim, who according to the Stratfor documents is connected to the narcos. He's one of the top I think he's the top telecommunications billionaire in Mexico. He's the majority shareholder of the New York Times. You know, so.
Well, I just heard, like, along those same lines, there's this think tank that's been co-opting some of the elections down in South America. You know anything about
I haven't followed that closely, but there was a great article in Bloomberg profiling a hacker who says that he's responsible for a bunch of fraudulent elections in South America. So,
and with the narrative, they're going down there and pretending to be like really, you know, radical but bringing in these ideas like stop taxing the rich and.
Yeah, I think like freedom of the press in South America means freedom of the corporate press to drown out the local voices.
Just real quickly, the Intercept, should we be skeptical? And Greenwald?
I don't know if you know about this. In May 2014, I publicly co-authored an anonymous press release that was a call to protest Greenwald. He was going on his book tour for his book Nowhere to Hide. And so we put out a press release encouraging people to go to these book tour stops and protest. Because basically, well, for several reasons. One, the main one was that while he and Snowden were becoming these sort of hacktivist stars, you know, like, oh, everything to do about hacking, that's Snowden and Greenwald, there were still tons of people who were still facing sentencing hearings and restitution charges and all this kind of stuff. And so we were saying, like, hey, where's the focus on these guys and these? And so the other thing was he basically privatized the Snowden cache of documents, where instead of being, you know, it was owned by the NSA. I mean, it should belong to us. It was owned by the NSA. Now it's basically owned by Greenwald and the Intercept, and they've parceled out, I think. The Cryptome keeps, the website Cryptome, which was a precursor to WikiLeaks, keeps a tally of what percentage of the Snowden documents have been released. And it's something only like 1% of the total cache, or 2%, or depending on which figures you trust.
Oh.